Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Ground Rounds today. My name's Tom Fodden. I'm the chair of Ground Rounds and organise this with Leslie Crichton, who's the NHST side lead for global citizenship, who I don't think is here today. Thanks very much for joining. Can I just remind anyone who has joined to mute themselves, otherwise we can hear you shuffling around and making yourself a cup of tea. So if you're not on mute, please do that now. I'm very pleased to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Lynn Erkut, who usually would be just 2 feet through that wall here, but is at home today, presenting over from home. And she has a long history of an interest in medical education. And she has various roles within the university, which I think she'll probably explain to you herself. And she's done a lot of great work in the last couple of years on how to improve the student experience and how we can improve the healthcare by using our more senior students in less of a them and us way and more of a we way. So I'm going to hand over to Lynn, who will then introduce the section, and then there are 2 talks, one from Jenna Cook and one from Dr. Joe Faramond. If you have any questions, please do put them in the chat box, or if you're brave and want to turn your camera on, then put your hand up and I'll throw to you at the end for the discussion. So with no further ado, thanks very much. Lynn, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. That's great. Yeah, thanks everybody for coming today. I wanted to use this opportunity to present 2 different projects that I've been involved in alongside some students over the past couple of years, and to really use that, I hope, as a springboard in your mind for any project you want to get involved with. I've got quite a lot of feedback. I think someone's unmuted. That's better. Okay, cool. Give me a second.
This is the ground round now. This is just the one about like the A&E medical students.
Ed's iPhone, yeah. Can you mute, please?
It's just starting now. Oh, I don't know. I just did the paperwork yesterday. So we'll find out. But I don't really want to do it when I'm on FA, but I just think it'll be a good experience too.
There's definitely a student who's chatting away now. He needs to mute.
Can everyone please mute their microphones? Ed, we know it's you. Can you please mute your microphone?
Do you think it'll be hard to get? Maybe, yeah.
Tom, can you mute all?
I can't mute him on Zoom, sorry.
You're probably right.
Can somebody text Ed and tell him to mute?
Oh, right. I think it'll filter down though. People will say that they're going to sign up.
Hopefully we won't learn anything too secretive.
I don't know
who this chap is.
Not very. Oh dear.
Are you to sign up with the bank?
No.
What do you want to do, Tom?
I'm not sure. I'm not entirely certain I know what I can do. There you go, he's muted.
Also,
he's
muted. Hooray, there we go. Thanks for joining us, Ed, and thanks for muting. Okay, I'm actually having trouble moving on my slides for some reason. I don't really know why. Any reason? Let's see if I'm...
Click that, that's it.
That's fine, that's fine. So, first of all, I just want to talk about how lucky we are, because we are in a super unique position in Dundee that the medical school and the university coexist in the same building, and the opportunities that can bring to us in the university and also us in NHS Tayside are endless, really. And I feel like, you know, maybe we take it for granted, or maybe we don't make enough of that potential collaboration that there could be. So I wanted to present a couple of these projects to maybe give you some ideas about something that's been burning in the back of your mind. Maybe now's the time to think about how we go forward. So the benefits of this coexisting relationship or geography are obviously research possibilities, teaching opportunities, postgraduate courses that we run, but also other things like FY recruitment, retention, trainee recruitment and retention. You know, people have a great time at university here and they remember that, and they feel fondly of Dundee and they want to come back and work as doctors. And so it is really in our interest as consultants and colleagues who work in NHST side to help provide an amazing educational experience for our students, partly because that's what we should be doing, but partly because it really helps us to build relationships and have great future colleagues. So I want to talk to you about two projects. The first was predominantly carried out by Jenna Cook, who is on this Zoom and who's going to present some of her project findings. I was the supervisor for this, so she undertook a BMSC in healthcare improvement, and basically the project was looking at improving the information for patients on discharge from hospital. The place that we undertook the pilot was in short stay medicine, which is within the acute medicine footprint, and it essentially was about writing the EDDs in a more patient-friendly way. And then the second project is something which I piloted last year and which will increase this year, and that was about paying medical students as healthcare support workers to help during winter pressures and evenings and weekends, and basically support with tasks to improve the efficiency and flow and care through AMU. So I'm going to hand over to Jenna now, who is going to present to you a little bit about her project, and I will mute myself. Jenna, I did see you earlier, so I'm presuming you're here. And I'm happy to move your slides on if you just tell me when, because I've embedded them in here.
Okay, can you all hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Wonderful. So thank you for the introduction. As Dr. Kurt said, my name is Jenna Cook, and today I will talk to you about improving patient understanding on discharge from the short stay unit in Ninewells. Next slide. So I'll be talking to you about the background of my project, the methods we used, conclusions we came to, and then a bit about what I learned about this project. Right. So I chose to do this because I've been very interested in communication. I previously looked at communication between healthcare staff, and I now wanted to look at the communication between staff and patients. It was widely regarded, both in literature and by your colleagues in the short stay unit, that patients had a limited understanding of their discharge domains. And that was for a variety of reasons, such as patients were fatigued, information was given to them in medical jargon, patients were unwilling to ask questions, they didn't have their friends and family around to help in their understanding. And if printed materials were given to them, they were written at a higher health literacy than the patient could understand. So from that, the aim was to improve patient understanding on discharge from the short stay unit on the domains of patients understanding their diagnosis, medication changes, follow-up plans, return instructions, and knowing who their consultant was. So, thank you. So the methods we used were informed by small tests of change, the changing COVID rules, relevant literature, and by what the healthcare team and patients liked. Next slide. Thank you. So this was a pre and post-interventional study of 2 weeks pre-intervention and 2 weeks post-intervention, looking at patients who were being discharged home from the short stay unit, thank you, who were then contacted by telephone to then ask them about their understanding of their diagnosis, medication changes, follow-up plans, return instructions, and if they knew who their consultant was. Patients were asked to rate their understanding on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being full understanding and 1 being none whatsoever, and that then formed their self-rated score. I then also gave patients a score of 1 to 5 based on how much I thought they understood, and I did that by comparing their verbal responses to their EDDs and to their patient notes. So post-intervention, this process was repeated, but this time when patients are being discharged home, they were given a copy of a patient-friendly discharge document. And that was written by the foundation year doctors and then given to patients by the nursing staff. And prior to implementation of this, a teaching session was ran for the FYs on how to structure this. And this was using things such as signposting, using non-medical language, and spacing information out, which were things that patients had said that they wanted. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this was a suggested patient document structure that I gave to the FYs in their teaching session, and also put a poster of this above the doctor's computers, which was a structure we suggested that they follow when writing the EDDs. So signposting, for example, we think you have, and then writing what their diagnosis was and what this is. Next slide, please. So what we found out, so pre-intervention, 45% of patients responded no or unsure to the question, did a member of staff explain to your diagnosis? 1 in 5 had no comparative understanding of their diagnosis. Next slide. 42% of patients had only partial concordance or lower for understanding instructions to take their new medications. And by that, I mean they either weren't able to tell me what the correct dose was or what it was. Oh, if you could go. 38% did not understand their follow-up plan. So that would either be they couldn't tell me where it was or when it was or what it was for. 17% did not know symptoms that would prompt them to visit their doctor. And then 69% did not know who their consultant was. Next slide, please. So here's a graph of our pre-intervention data collection. 5 is full understanding, 1 is no understanding at all. And the green line is patient self-rated understanding. And then the orange line is my comparative assessment of their understanding. I just click the thing once more, Faye. Thank you. And then if you don't like graphs, here is a quote from one of the patients pre-intervention. So as we can see, patients had overestimated their understanding almost all the time. And when I stratified this information based on age group, I found that the older the patients got, the greater this gap was between their understanding. And it also showed why potentially patients didn't ask clarifying questions because they actually weren't aware of what they didn't know, which posed a big problem. So next slide, please. Thank you. So post-intervention, we can see that this gap had closed. And if you click the thing once more for me, thank you. So they're compared, when looking further into the data, I found that comparatively, so my assessment of their understanding of their diagnosis had increased from pre-intervention being 3.4 to post-intervention 4.8, so almost full understanding. And if you could click it once more for me. And patients understanding who their consultant was also substantially increased. So previously, only 31% knew who their consultant was. And then post-intervention, 80% knew who their consultant was. So a tangible difference was made. If you can click. Thank you. So in conclusion, we found that patient understanding was in fact limited in discharge, and that by giving of a patient-friendly document, this aided in patients' understanding. And patients also really liked this because it meant when their friends and family weren't around, they could take this home and it was written in a way that everyone could understand. So they felt like it was better for them because they could help the person who was looking after them also understand what went on. So what I learned about this is your supervisor is key and your team is really, really important. You know, there were so many different people who were involved in this project, and it wouldn't have been possible without any of them. And a big thank you to Dr. Erkut for helping me along the way. And Pdsa Cycles, so the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycles, are really integral to any healthcare improvement project. And this was the first proper project that I had done. And it's a fantastic structured way for you to essentially funnel your ideas. Driver diagrams and fishbone diagrams are also really helpful in finding potential ideas which could go to become improvements, and it's a great visual way to write everything down. And finally, as it's always been told to us, but literature reviews are, although take a while, are really beneficial, and you can get a lot of ideas about what may work in the future, what may work in your setting, just by reading around the subject. So if you could just click, that is, I believe that's me. The final thing is my email address if you have any questions you don't want to ask me now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenna. I'm just going to go back slightly because I think the 2 bits of learning for me on this. The first is learning related to Jenna's project. So it is mortifying to me as a consultant that only 30% of our patients in our unit knew who their consultant was. It's not good enough, but it's not just a short-stay medicine thing. It's not just a Ninewells thing. That is really concordant with what the literature says is the case, but it's not something that we should really accept as is okay. And so definitely something really important that we need to improve upon. And as Jenna said, this understanding gap is super important because even in patients who we think understand what's going on, or even in patients who they themselves think they understand what's going on, there's often discordance between our understanding, and that's so important. And when things are written down, it gives people a chance to revisit them and to look at the way in which they're written down. Jenna normally, Jenna's really good at putting things in a way that is patient friendly, and normally when she does some teaching for the FY, she presents a slide that Somebody needs to mute. I'm not sure who that is, but could you make sure you're muted, please, if you're not? Thank you. So as Jenna points out to the FYs, that the average reading age in the UK is 8. And so when we're writing stuff for patients, including discharge documents, we need to bear that in mind. And at the moment, what we do is, although we give our patients a copy of the discharge, we write it still essentially for the GP, and we just hope that the patient can decipher something in amongst all of that about what's happening. But instead, if we centre what we're writing around the patient themselves, then of course the GP can still understand that and can see some of the coding data and the more important formal medical stuff that they need to see. But it also is helpful for our GP colleagues to write it like this, because one of the things I hadn't appreciated as a secondary care doctor is how often patients actually go to their GPs after discharge from hospital to say, oh, I didn't really understand what happened, could you explain this to me? And that is our job as secondary care doctors to do that. And our primary care colleagues are under so much pressure just now. We certainly cannot be adding to their workload by not communicating effectively in hospital. So the second bit of learning is just for me about the fact that when Jenna got in touch asking if I could be a supervisor, I think all of us feel a bit jiggered at the moment. You know, we've all got pandemic fatigue, we're tired, and the thought of taking on new projects is hard. But in fact, this is a project that I'd wanted to do for ages, and Jenna came with the kind of the time and the enthusiasm and the want to do this. And by actually getting Jenna involved, a project that probably I still wouldn't have got round to in 3 years' time, we've done this pilot, and we're now looking to roll it out in EMU proper over the next few weeks, and we're working on that. So 2 bits of learning really about the content, but also just about actually being a supervisor is not always extra work. Sometimes it actually helps with your work, because you have this person who has time and effort and energy that can help you data collect or do some of the stuff that you want to do. So sorry, I'm going to go to my second project, which was I piloted last year. And this is where I, as a consultant in EMU, recognised how pressured and how busy EMU was, and how actually a lot of the barriers to flow relate to just that time it takes to waiting for patients to get their blood tests and their ECGs and things like that. And the earlier that these things can be done, the quicker the results are back, the quicker we can make decisions, and the quicker we can patients can either be discharged home or can move to a downstream ward. And so the Unscheduled Care Board asks every year for people to put in bids for winter pressure ideas. And last year I put in a small bid to see if we could pay some final year medical students to help us in EMU. And this obviously was going to be of help to us, but also potentially, or I hoped would be of benefit to our students, because in the pandemic they'd had less clinical exposure due to COVID-19, and I thought maybe this could be a win-win. And so long story short, there was a bit of faffery involved in getting the project off the ground, but once we did, it became clear that what we were allowed to do was to employ students as healthcare support workers, doing mainly task-based stuff like bloods, ECGs, ABGs, sometimes some OBS to try and help us with flow. So last year, the original bid was for 9 weeks of shifts from December to January, but it was actually so successful that it was extended to March, and basically because winter never ends. Students worked in EMU and also an ambulatory care clinic, and it was really they were very flexible in terms of they would turn up, see where the work was to be done, and get on with that. They worked in tandem with the FY1s, asking FYs what tasks were to do, and also along with the triage nurse based in EMU. So really when patients were arriving, they were doing their bloods, doing their ECGs, and also just other jobs that needed done, working as a team with the FYs. And so they got lots of practice with practical procedures, but also developed insight into kind of complex systems in EMU. They felt like part of a team. And I think that's a really important thing, because sometimes, hopefully not advertently, but sometimes inadvertently, medical students can feel on the peripheries of what we're doing. They don't feel part of the team. Sometimes they feel like they're adding to the workload of clinicians and things. Whereas in this, they really felt there was an opportunity for them to learn, but actually to help and to be part of that team. And they got paid, which is also important. And I'll come on to that in a moment. But I've got a colleague, Joe Fireman, who's in FY1 at the moment, who was a final year medical student last year who undertook this project. And he's just going to speak briefly on his experiences of the project. Joe, are you there? I'll move the slides on.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear. Yep.
And so as Dr. Urquhart said, my name's Joe. I'm a FY1 currently in general surgery in Ninewells, and I'm a Dundee graduate. I'm also currently on annual leave at the moment. So if you hear my dogs kicking off in the background, I do apologize, but I can't really do anything about that. So I'll try and get through this quite quickly. So I'm basically just going to be reiterating a lot of the points that Dr. Urquhart has already made, but kind of getting it from a student perspective. So predominantly what you get from it, and there's a degree of kind of a bit tongue-in-cheek about this, but the first point there I think is a very important one. You do get paid, and it's a pretty good chunk of cash, to be honest, in the back pocket to kind of help you kind of keep going as a student. But it also, I think, mentally bolsters you quite a bit to receive some form of remuneration for employing skill sets that you have spent the last few years developing and honing. And I think, you know, I'd also done some work as a healthcare assistant over the COVID-19 pandemic, and you don't feel quite as involved or part of a team when you're, you know, helping just like dress down beds or bring patients cups of tea and things like that. So being able to kind of get hands-on and do a little bit more, I felt was a very rewarding experience. You also get more experience with practical procedures, as has been highlighted already. And I think this is less relevant for exam purposes and more relevant for the day-to-day of what you're going to be doing as an actual doctor. So you're probably not going to be asked to demonstrate perfect putting in a cannula technique in your OSCEs, for example. But believe me when I say you will be doing a lot of cannulas, a lot of blood taking as an FY1. And you don't want to be that FY1 who is really like hot to trot on their medicine side of things, but can't do a practical procedure to save themselves and have to ask their colleagues to stick around to, you know, put in that tricky cannula. You know, you can be that person who finds that difficult vascular patient and gets the cannula in first time, and you know, you don't have to ask for help every single time. So I think that's a good opportunity to kind of bolster those abilities. You get exposure to a busy working environment and a kind of secondhand experience of prioritizing tasks. So this, I think, is another kind of important point, because I was going to have a slide about what you're not expected to do or what you don't get from it, but it seemed like a bit of a downer. So you're not expected to clerk, you're not expected to prescribe, and you're not expected to make any kind of big decisions about patient care or anything like that. You will, as a student, have a dedicated block at some point in AMU to kind of get a bit more experience like that. But from here, you are very much kind of gleaning what you can from the perpetually stressed out and tired looking FYs that you are going to be there to support. So you're essentially there just to kind of help lighten the load on them a little bit. And with that in mind comes this kind of fostering of teamwork abilities that Dr. Urquhart also talked about. It's really important to respect your colleagues and to know how much they're going to be saving you all of the time, especially if you're a brand new FY and you don't really know what's going on. Respect your nursing staff, respect your AHPs and everything, because they will definitely be catching you when you fall repeatedly. So this is a good opportunity to try and, like, you know, start developing those kind of experiences with your teammates, and kind of like Dr. Erkut said, you don't really feel like you're as much on the peripheries. You're very much kind of part of this kind of well-oiled machine. And then building patient rapport as well, I think, is very important. I think Dundee in general, students are quite good at this, but I know for myself, I like to waffle. I like to talk too much, and AMU is quite a fast throughput of patients. You're going to be seeing lots and lots of different patients in quite a condensed amount of time. So you will get good at getting consent, explaining procedures and stuff like that in a very kind of streamlined, succinct manner, at the same time as being able to inject just enough personality without kind of, you know, sounding like a machine, which I think is quite important. Next slide, please. So how to prepare for your shifts. Make sure you know where you're going. make sure you get there on time, maybe 5 minutes early, just to make sure, you know, kind of you've introduced yourself and said, right, I'm here to do the job. Booking the shifts early. So while the program was extended when I did it, even so, it never felt like enough shifts. I always wanted to kind of get more. There was always somebody who was like click and refresh every 5 minutes and getting all the good shifts. So just because you go on the staff bank once and you don't see anything, don't be discouraged and think, oh, well, I'll check again in a week or two's time, because they may have kind of gone up and it may have immediately gone in that time as well. So make sure you're on it and book what you can. But at the same time, don't just book up absolutely everything, because that's a little bit unfair to your colleagues. Be ready to work, because you will be an invaluable asset to a bunch of FYs who are still relatively new to the job, will be perpetually sleep deprived, over caffeinated. They'll look at you with a mixture of relief, anger, any other kind of emotion under the sun. But believe me, they're happy to see you there. You are going to be helping them out a lot. And also, this is important, again, something I already touched on. You're there to work, you're not there to be a student. So you're there to kind of pick up some of the tasks that you're going to be doing as an FY1, but it's not necessarily an opportunity for you to kind of bring along your skills passport or your Rocky and stuff like that. That might happen, but that shouldn't be your goal when you go along to these sessions. With that in mind, you kind of want to be familiar with your practical procedures. So I'm not going to say you have to be an expert in venipuncture and stuff like that before you go along, but at least know where ECG stickers go, at least know, you know, the basic procedure for, you know, putting in a cannula. And I think that's kind of quite important. Also, with that in mind, don't be afraid to double check with an FY or a nurse or whatever. And don't be afraid to ask for help, because from a FY's perspective, and you'll be in the same boat in a year or two time, would much rather you ask us once to show you the proper way to do something, rather than you do it the incorrect way 10 times and then we have to kind of go back and kind of catch up on all that. But it is a really good experience, all things considered. There we go. Yeah. In summary, the AMU shifts are a really good way to kind of bolster your practical skills. It gives you a good exposure to what FY life is like, without a lot of the kind of responsibilities initially that FYs are going to be faced with. So you get to see what it's like being part of this team and providing invaluable support. Yeah. So if you've got any questions, my email address is just there. And thank you all for listening.
That's amazing. Thanks so much, Joe. That's brilliant. So I've also got a little bit of feedback from the kind of other staff members as well. So obviously the FYs were delighted to have some help, and the students got a good experience. Thanks to Joe for sharing that. There's somebody who's unmuted. I'm not sure who that is, but can you mute yourself, please? Because I can get feedback. Thanks. So consultant colleagues found it really useful, and all of them unanimously said how helpful, how flexible, how enthusiastic the students were. That sometimes they would turn up in AMU and we'd need them in AMU. Other times, if ambulatory was busy, they would move to ambulatory, and there was no issues and no concerns, and they just were like an amazing bunch of people who just helped go where the work was and do some work. And more senior trainee doctors commented that, you know, this particular trainee who just moved to Dundee, who'd worked elsewhere, felt that the students were brilliant, really confident, and that they thought it was a really helpful thing. And one of the concerns at the beginning of all of this was that I don't know, that somehow there would be some conflict between the students and nurses, but I'm very reassured that there was absolutely no conflict, that everyone was just absolutely delighted to have the extra help, and that nursing colleagues really found the students to be a real asset, that they worked really hard, that they came at a busy time that we needed them, and they did a great job. So I want to just talk briefly about why pay. And that's because there's a few reasons, but I do think it's really important. And I think it's really important that we do pay for this project. The GMC commissioned this report on the FIY year during COVID-19. So, you know, the early graduation of graduates who became these kind of interim foundation year doctors. And what this report showed is the features of a good interim role. So what makes a really good bridging role between being a student and being a fully qualified person? And I think this table is in that report, which you'll be able to see on GMC website. But I think that our project here covers almost all of these bases. You know, it's a role as a paid qualified professional. We have a clear application process that okay, this isn't supernumerary, but they're not there to do, you know, EGDs and things, very specific roles. Although this doesn't avoid antisocial hours, we've done that on purpose, because what we don't want to do, because this is voluntary and because it's in addition to studies, we've done it evenings and weekends so that it doesn't interfere with the actual learning that obviously is important in terms of medical school. A role long enough to make a difference. So the original pilot last year was for 9 weeks. It went up to 4 months. This year we started already and is likely to go into the spring. So this gives like quite a good opportunity for people to go repeatedly back to the same place, to build those relationships, build those skills, become familiar with context. A mutually understood role, so staff and students both enjoy and understand why they're there, clear responsibilities and duties, and a space for informal as well as formal support. So that kind of informal curriculum stuff when they're hanging out with the FYs and going for coffee and on the ward, but also formal support. I'm there, I do the induction, and I'm there for any point of contact that anyone needs. And the consultants and senior doctors also provide that kind of in the moment during shifts. The other reason to pay is because medical school is blooming expensive. And that's, you know, because although some people don't pay tuition fees in Scotland, if you're doing it as a second degree, or if you're from out with Scotland, you will pay tuition fees. And I think there are some people who perhaps graduated many moons ago who bought their house on Perth Road for £23,000 in 1993, who don't understand the current financial situation that medical students find themselves in. And I think it's important that we do understand that by the time you get to 5th year, a lot of people are skint as they can be. And so when we are so in need of help, and when the medical students are so well trained and so able to give us that help, then we should financially remunerate them for it. Because being able to volunteer comes from a very privileged position, and not everyone can afford to volunteer, and we shouldn't expect people to afford to volunteer. If the need is there, then we should pay students to help us for these particular roles. I'm just sharing this paper because I found it while I was looking for something about medical student debt, and whilst obviously it's a slight tangent, was interested to see that female students are more likely over their career to pay back more fees because of interest than male students, because females earn less money, which is a whole other grand round, but something which, as ever, is incredibly disappointing and shows the wage gap that exists within medicine at the moment. So this year with this particular project, the exciting news is that I have 7 times the budget. So, and we've started this week. There were already 15 students who are on the bank. Another 100 students have volunteered to take part, and they're all getting signed up to the bank just now. And so we're aiming to have shifts not just in AMU, but also in Ward 4 and PRI, possibly in ASRU. And then beyond that, we need to think bigger. Could this be a permanent year-round thing that we have in Dundee, that we have as part of our 5th year, that we recognise, let's face it, staffing, you know, we're only going to have more patients. Staffing is only going to be a bother, like, you know, difficult for us. And could this actually be something that our students in Dundee become part of, and really it's a win-win, because it also offloads some of the pressure from our FY colleagues, you know, and it will help with postgraduate training surveys and various things too. So I can't see there being a downside to this. So I've shared kind of 2 different projects there, but the overarching theme, which I would like to say is about students as partners. And I know, like, excuse me, let me go back, but I know as the past 18 months, but not just 18 months, it's hard working in the NHS, like as a consultant or as a registrar, as a trainee. And sometimes you get emails from the medical school asking for supervisors and these sort of things. And sometimes you think, God, I just don't have the extra capacity to take somebody on. But actually, if you have an idea or if you have a project, students add so much to that. They bring a completely different perspective, but they bring time, because they will have time as part of if they're doing it as an SSC or a BMSC, they will have time to do data collection. It is in their interest to do a good job of it, you know, because they're trying to get a good degree or they're trying to get a good mark in their SSC. they learn a lot through it, but you learn a lot through what they bring to you, because they bring a completely different perspective. We are so lucky to have all of these students aligned with our NHS organisation, and they are our future colleagues. I think one of the reasons that I love medical education so much, and one of the things that I feel sad about, is when people don't understand that when you're teaching a student, you're not teaching a first year or a second or third year student, you're teaching someone who in 2 years time or 3 years time will be your colleague, or in 10 years time will be your consultant colleague. And are you doing a good enough job of enthusing them about your specialty? Are you helping bring out their love of medicine? But also, what can they bring to us? They can bring so much. And so it's really just a shout out and a plea to say that there are loads of opportunities to work alongside students as partners. Things like BMSC projects, summer vacation scholarships, SSC supervision. And I know that perhaps sometimes it feels like the cognitive load of taking on a student sometimes feels tough, but actually I would say the amount of benefit that can bring to you personally as a consultant, to your service, if there's something you've been wanting to do for ages but just not had the time to do it, the opportunities are endless. And I think if we just if we look at this little Friends meme, it does sometimes feel a little bit like we're pushing this flipping sofa up a twisty staircase. But you know what, if we just can pivot our thinking and think that this is not additional work, that this is people who are here to learn from us, but with us, and add to what we can do for the NHS, I really think that the opportunities are endless. So on that note, I will stop. I have not managed to keep at all a note or an eye on the chat, so I have no idea if there have been any questions, but I will let Tom chair some of the questions. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Lynn. That's really, really, really interesting. And thanks to Jenna and Joe for presenting as well. I've always agreed with you that I think medical students, in fact, any of us, when we don't feel useful, we don't feel valued, and 25 years ago, I remember being a senior medical student, standing on ward rounds thinking I might as well not be here. There's no added value in me being on this ward round at all, and that's very demoralizing. And I think what you're doing here is showing us senior students that we really value them, and we value their input in lots of different ways. So I think that what your work is really fantastic. The comments have mainly been asking people to mute, and then lots of compliments to you. Delighted to see that this work being presented. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to pose specifically to either of any of the speakers? I'll maybe ask Joe, if you hadn't been paid to do this, would you have still done it?
I probably would have done, because I felt like our clinical time was, as was mentioned, quite limited because of COVID. I probably wouldn't have done it as often as I tried to. Yes, I probably still would have done it, but I think in terms of principle, I think it's only fair to financially compensate the students that are volunteering their spare time to help out with this, because ultimately you don't want to turn them into a commodity. So I think that is certainly the right way to encourage people to do it.
Yeah, I agree with this. I think that you're doing work. It's you should be paid for it. Sarah Martins de Silva has messaged to say, great presentation, Jenna. I hope you've introduced this as a permanent change for the ward, but what did you do, or what did you write when there was no conclusive diagnosis? So you said that many people don't know what's wrong with them. That's often because we don't know what's wrong with them. So was that a confounding thing?
So it was whatever the FY or the consultant had said to the FY to write, that was written. I didn't influence what they wrote, but rather how they put forward their information. So when I was comparing what the patient had said to what the EDD said, if that was it's still under investigation, then that counts as they had been communicated with properly and they understood what was going on. So they didn't necessarily need to have, as long as it matched the two, what they said and what was written down, then it counted as a concordance and they had full understanding. Full understanding didn't necessarily mean they had to know exactly what was wrong with them. If they knew something was still under investigation, then it was still adequately communicated and it was good.
I'm not sure if it was you or was Lynn spoke about the challenges of people being discharged and then immediately going to the phone or speak to their GP because they don't know what's going on, and then that extra link of communication. This is more of a comment than a question really, but we had a grand round 2 years ago, maybe 3. Things merge into, time passes differently in COVID, doesn't it? But about writing to patients, writing letters to patients. And I've been writing letters to patients from outpatients ever since that grand round and found it hugely helpful. But we don't always do that for discharge summaries. So these EDDs go to the GP. We did a trial in Ward 3 of giving the patient a copy. But it does mean when you write your EDD, you have to write it very, very differently. Any just thoughts on that?
Sorry, if I may also add, so the point of where I did my data collection, so at that point, I know now it's suggested that all patients are given a copy of their EDD. But at the time where I did it, some patients were being given a copy of their EDD anyway because they had asked for it. But the way it was written, it had no impact on their understanding whatsoever. And I think a lot of them seemed to be put off by it because it was a lot of information that they didn't understand. And in terms of the GPs, that was something that I'd read about, that in the literature that had added pressure to GPs. And also when Dr. Erkut and I presented this to the patient quality improvement group for the hospital, one of the GPs stated that actually she thought it was a great idea because a lot of the time jargon that is used in the hospital, she was not familiar with. So having things written in a patient-friendly way is also beneficial to the GP colleagues because then they don't have to look at these specialist things that they don't necessarily know.
A GP in the audience has said just that. So Claire Stubbings has just written to say, some of the letters I've seen written to the patient have helped me more than as a GP than the EDD. And when I started writing to patients, I worried a bit that GPs may find it just very clunky that I'm writing everything in longhand, but I've not had a single bit of feedback in that regard. And I've similarly never had a single bit of feedback from the patient saying, why did you write to me? I didn't want to know all this, which is perhaps just to be expected. If you've not seen that grand round, it is available on the YouTube channel and I think it's really interesting. Leslie Crichton, my co-chair, is here. I'm sorry, Leslie, I said at the beginning you weren't here, but it's doing you a disservice. Says, I sometimes think we forget we're all humans and we can speak to each other as such. So that's a good sentiment. Any other questions?
I was just going to say, Tom, one of the interesting things which we must recognise is we're writing it in kind of layperson's terms, but actually some of the FYs found that quite tricky because they hadn't done that before. And in particular, FYs where English is not their first language, it's actually harder. And we have to recognise that in some ways that it's harder for them to do that than to write it in kind of medical jargon. So there's just really a point. It's not something that's not overcomable, but it's just you have to recognise when you're making a change, the unintended consequences of making it more challenging for other people, and just how do you make sure that you don't disadvantage a different group of people, basically. So yeah, that was just the point. But I think Jenna took some qualitative information from the FYs, and they said that they found it harder at the beginning, but they kind of got into it after a while. That basically they just had to change the way that their brains worked and their thinking was in terms of typing what they were typing, basically. I think Fiona Jimmy's got her hand up, Tom.
I'm sorry, I'll come to Fiona in just 2 seconds. I just wanted to agree with you. When I went to writing letters to patients, it took me ages to get into a rhythm and a cadence and doing it. And the letters took a lot longer to dictate, whereas now I would find it quite strange not to. So you just have to stick with things. Fiona, do you want to stick your microphone on your camera?
Yep. I don't know if you want my camera on, but there we go.
Oh, we can see you. There you are.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. I found that very interesting. We have a sort of standard within the British Association of Perinatal Medicine that we should copy all our neonatal intensive care discharges to families, that they should get a copy before they go home, for many of the reasons that have just been described. And when we do it, I find it incredibly useful. It is much harder to make happen than you would think, but certainly in that prolonged stay, very emotionally difficult situation at the beginning, parents often have a very, very poor recollection of what has happened to their baby or their children in the early stages. And it's part of the whole journey of debriefing, which I think is really helpful for the psychological support of families. And I will perhaps put forward an SSC student to work on that with me for next year, because I know we're looking for people, and perhaps that's given me a good opportunity to find somebody. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Fiona. Okay, I can see no more hands and no more questions in the chat box. So I'll draw things to a conclusion. Thank you very much to Lynn, to Jenna, and to Joe for joining us from home. Thanks to everyone else for dialing in today. And thanks for the discussion at the end. Next week's Grand Rounds, we're hoping, if I can organise the technology, to be back into the Ganachie again. We can only accommodate 40 people in there, so we'll have to try and sort out that we can get people there and then other people to Zoom in, but it should work. More details later. But the gastroenterologists have organised to bring Richard Hansen, who's a pediatric gastroenterologist from the Royal Hospital for Children in Glasgow. He's very well spoken of. He's a Dundee graduate. It's nice to get some of our alumni back to speak. And he's going to talk about the microbiome in the gut in relation to inflammatory bowel disease. And the microbiome is something that in the medical school in Dundee, in the research part, that is a very hot topic, particularly in the lungs, which of course I'm interested in. So please do come along to that. And this video will appear on YouTube once I've edited it. And thanks very much for coming. See you next week.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks, everybody.